In 2014, Achilles included a toggle on 20XX which allowed for dashback to be increased to a 2-frame window. 2 years later, Cardano advocated for this code to be standardized. I infamously replied to Cardano's tweet by saying that we can't standardize any type of software mod, as we wouldn't be playing Melee at that point. This was a common sentiment at the time, but then just a year later, I shifted gears completely. On June 9, 2017, I released a video called The GameCube Controller Project, which advocated for not only dashback but also several other mechanics to be fixed. People had begun to sense that there was merit in this type of project by that point, but its exact implications weren't clear. Practical Task, for example, made a tweet suggesting that increasing dashback to 2 frames was warranted, but that we'd be opening up a can of worms by doing so. This tweet couldn't have been more accurate in retrospect. What caused me to shift gears in 2017 was the research I did in order to design the box. As I studied the game, I found that quite a few mechanics didn't behave in a logical manner. This went well past obvious ones such as dashback and shield drop. I wrote chapters on 1.0 Cardinal, for example, and I also brought up dash out of crouch to other people behind the scenes. Several years have passed since then, and what I've concluded is that Melee has 11 faulty mechanics in total. Some of these mechanics tend to go overlooked. ADT Shield, for example, may have decided a set between Moki and Cody just last weekend at Genesis 9. During this last game, last stock interaction, ADT Shield caused Moki's dash attack to hit Cody simply because his controller received a bad pull. This arguably won Moki the set. The reason I'm bringing up this interaction is because, as Practical Task suggested in 2017, a can of worms was inevitably going to be opened. Back then, it was controversial enough to mod the game in any capacity, and so it's understandable that the community started out with a conservative approach. This approach involved fixing dashback and shield drop exclusively. However, now that quite some time has passed, it's important to recognize that dashback and shield drop are no different from the other mechanics on a technical level, and that fixing the rest of them does make a difference. Part of the reason I'm bringing up these other mechanics is because the community has recently had many box-related complaints. Even though the box isn't securing top tournament results, many people still feel that it's the better controller, and I'm inclined to agree with them. However, what I don't agree with is the sentiment that we ought to nerf the box. I say this because the box has already been given the full list of in-game mechanic nerfs. On the other hand, the GameCube controller has not been given the full list of fixes to uncompetitive mechanics. UCF.8, the current patch the community plays on, only addresses dashback, wiggle, and shield drop, and I'd argue that its shield drop fix is incomplete. Thus, I'd like to propose that we shift the goalpost within these controller discussions. In the Box Manifesto, which I published in 2018, I explained that the goal of our software mod wasn't as simple as solving the controller lottery. The way I viewed it was that solving the controller lottery was more of a byproduct of the goal, which was to create a modernized version of the game. To explain what I meant by this, consider the following. The way UCF was pitched to the community was that POD could cause dashback's performance to vary between about 50% and 95%, which made controller equality impossible. Thus, we needed to address this by increasing dashback's window to 2 frames. While this is a valid way to justify fixing dashback, I don't believe it's a necessary justification at all. Another way to justify fixing dashback is simply the fact that its 1-frame window is a game design oversight. This is easy to conclude based on the fact that Dash Forward utilizes the exact same travel route, but it has a 2-frame window. What this proves is that we didn't actually need POD to justify fixing dashback, as we could have just as easily done this from a game design perspective. Furthermore, what's interesting about this perspective is that it leads us down the rabbit hole of creating a fully modernized game version. This game version would address less well-known mechanics, such as the ADT Shield issue I showed earlier. Something interesting is that by taking this approach, we end up balancing the box in a much healthier way. This is because the box automatically bypasses the faults in 10 out of the 11 problematic mechanics, with dash out of crouch being the only exception. Something I'd like to emphasize is that while the need to balance the box does somewhat force the issue in terms of fixing these mechanics, it isn't needed to justify fixing them by any means. These are all uncompetitive mechanics, and so it's important to separate 1.03 from the box in the sense that it would have been good for the game regardless of the box's existence. The next aspect of 1.03 that I'd like to clarify is why each of the individual categories of mods ought to be included. There are areas in which certain design choices may not be entirely clear, and so I'd like to go over my rationale in full. The first mechanics I'll be going over are the ones that have a 1-frame polling window. UCF started out with dashback and added wiggle later on, but recently I showed that SDI on frame 2 of hit lag and Daraki wall jump are identical in this regard. I'd like to encourage for nothing to be excluded here, as there shouldn't be a preference based on which mechanics are important and which aren't. Diraki wall jump, for example, is the least important mechanic on this entire list, but it's still logically consistent to fix. The next mechanics I'd like to bring attention to are the ones that suffer from a hardware issue. The ADT shield issue I brought up earlier is arguably the most important fix overall after dashback and shield drop. I say this because there's an entirely new button layout that's enabled by this fix. If you're using a Z-jump layout, which many players agree is ideal, then there's an issue in the form of the R button being less accessible. Since your right index finger will be occupied by Z, L has to perform more duties than usual if you're using a traditional grip. The only way for L to perform all the duties it needs to, those being an ADT immune shield, analog L cancel, and light shield, is to fix ADT on a software level. This lets you get everything done with one index finger on each side of the controller, as I demonstrate in this clip. Aside from that, there's no reason for Z-jump not to be turned into a software side toggle, as this would save people from having to purchase it as a hardware mod. Next, I'll be going over the microscopic range fixes. The UCF team has acknowledged that both Shield Drop and 1.0 Cardinal are mechanics in need of repair, but I disagree with them in terms of how they should be fixed. The Shield Drop fix on UCF.8 has been ingrained for many years, but it has an issue with its Y value cutoff. Negative 0.7875 doesn't actually correspond with anything in-game, and the UCF team has conceded that this could be improved based on what they have planned for their next update. UCF.84 accommodates notches that are above the shield drop range by increasing the range upward by 4 values. However, this comes with the downside of changing shield drop's actuation point, which by all means shouldn't be legal. UCF.84 acknowledges this and then compensates for it by making it so that the newly added coordinates have a 1-frame delay, which I believe is even more disagreeable. For one, this timing delay makes it so that the newly added coordinates actuate later than the ones that previously existed. This defeats the purpose of the fix being proposed, as it wouldn't actually add any viable coordinates. To make matters worse, there are implications created by this fix that should be avoided. For example, if we can legally increase shield drop upward by 4 values and compensate for that with a timing delay, then who's to say we can't increase it even further upward? Would this be justified by, say, a 2 or 3 frame delay? Naturally, we should look to avoid these types of implications. The proper way to accommodate notches that are above the shield drop range is actually to increase the range further downward. This is because increasing the range downward lets you overshoot, and so no matter where your notch is located, a shield drop will work. That brings me to 1.0 Cardinal, which is another mechanic that gets debated. I'm personally in favor of a maximized 1.0 range, whereas the UCF team has proposed increasing the range by 6 values on their latest version. Part of the reason I'm against this is the fact that the rim will transition from 0.9875 to 1.0, then back to 0.9875. Since we have to play game designer in this situation, I figured I'd point out that this is aesthetically disagreeable, as it makes more sense to remain at 1.0. More importantly, I don't believe that preserving 0.9875 along the rim comes with much of an upside. The argument in favor of preserving 0.9875 is that it can be used for magnitude-based up Bs. However, this is outweighed by the fact that 21 characters don't have magnitude-based up Bs, and so those characters are strictly hurt by this design choice. Furthermore, even the 5 characters that do benefit more overall from a maximized 1.0 range, as this range ensures that they pinpoint 1.0 during a dash dance. Maximizing 1.0 is also logically consistent with the shield drop fix that I've recommended. The next fixes I advocate for are the corridor range fixes. The more important of the two is the vertical throws fix, which addresses an issue that can cause you to accidentally input a side throw. This issue decides games all the time, and so it can't be underestimated. The issue exists because the range for vertical throws is limited to the vertical corridor, which was probably an oversight during Melee's development. Up tilt and down tilt, for example, utilize a cone-shaped range, which makes it so you'll never miss these inputs. This is the range used for vertical throws on newer Smash titles, and so I'm of the belief that we should modernize this mechanic. Another area where the corridor issue exists is C-stick ledge fall. When you perform this ledge fall, you may find that it's easy to accidentally aerial into SD. This is because you'll perform an aerial by transitioning past the cardinal corridor, and so this mechanic becomes more viable if that line is shifted. The last fixes to go over are the special case polling fixes. The SDI remainder fix is the more important of the two SDI components. This fix addresses the fact that your SDI magnitude can be stifled by an early poll by making it so that the second frame within the SDI range counts. The SDI remainder fix plays a huge role during jab resets and slide-offs, which are normally more luck-based than people realize. On a GameCube controller, you'll often fail to escape these situations because of an early SDI pull, and so adding the remainder makes the defensive game more competitive. The other special case fixes are the dash out of crouch fixes. I agree with the UCF team that the 3 coordinates that have to be crossed in order to make it from crouch to dash ought to be fixed. However, I'd like to encourage for a 3-frame window to be standardized as well. This is the more notable of the 2 dash out of crouch fixes. The reason I'm in favor of a 3-frame dash out of crouch window is because I believe dashes should be functional, as they're a core movement option within the game. Furthermore, what tends to get overlooked is that UCF actually disrupts Vanilla Melee's dash hierarchy. I say this because dashback is the worst of the 3 dash mechanics on Vanilla, and so if it's the only one we fix, then that arbitrarily benefits certain characters. Marth, for example, has better matchups against characters like Sheik and Captain Falcon if dash out of crouch is left unfixed, and so while dashback out of crouch went overlooked for many years, I do believe it's appropriate to fix it as well. In closing, the box is closely tied to 1.03 because the box raises concerns in terms of game balance. However, the box is not necessary to justify the fixes that I've gone over. It would be warranted to modify the game in this exact manner regardless, as these 11 mechanics don't behave as they should. Thus, I can't emphasize enough that fixing these mechanics should be destigmatized, as modernizing the game is a good thing. I'd also like to encourage for box users to oppose the idea that nerfs that fall outside of this scope, such as travel time nerfs, would be appropriate to consider. This would be a concession to making our controllers less functional when the best way to level the playing field is to make the GameCube controller more functional. In general, I believe that shifting the goalpost and giving 1.03 the test phase it deserves is the best move for the community. With that being said, make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section, and thanks for tuning into the video.